it can't be.
The year is 1942. Japanese forces have entrenched themselves throughout the Solomon Islands, which lie just to the northeast of Australia. Allied forces move quickly to rout them out of the strategic island chain, the United States Navy heading first toward the island of Guadalcanal. But while the Japanese were busily preparing their Solomon Island defenses and air bases in the sweltering jungle heat, they remained entirely unaware of another kind of enemy. Even if any of the beleaguered Solomon Islanders had wanted to warn the Japanese invaders about what monstrous beings ostensibly lived in the island's innermost regions of unexplored jungles and cave systems, the Japanese probably wouldn't have believed them anyway. But as the Marines swarmed onto the beaches of Guadalcanal and the following U.S. Army divisions arrived to push the Japanese soldiers further and further towards the island's center, terrifying rumors began to spread that something was killing off their men from their rear flanks. Something massive. Something unbelievable. Something that was eating the men alive. This is the story of the Solomon Island Giants. The mist which hangs before you
offers you a choice
to pass through
or to escape.
Beyond it are
Stories
which defy
the explanation
and fly in the face.
of what we know to be real,
It is a void of both
reality
and impossibility.
of both fact
and superstition.
You alone are left to discern
what to believe as you pass through what we call
the fog
of war.
Before 1941, the idea of World War II was an abstract concept for Solomon Islanders. The war was happening far away in Europe, or at worst, in the mainland regions of Asia, which was still thousands of miles away. But following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the island began to finally experience the far-reaching impacts of the war. Britain began evacuating their colonial settlers off the islands and sending local workers either back to their villages or into hiding to prepare for a potential invasion. Sure enough, with the Japanese Empire's aim to create a defensive buffer against attack from the Allied forces, in May of 1942, the Solomon Islands would become the furthest extent of their military island outposts, far to the south of Japan. They quickly occupied the primary islands, beginning the construction of an airstrip on Guadalcanal, along with other floatplane bases and defensive fortifications. With this occupation threatening to cut communication and shipping lines between Australia and the United States, and leave Australia exposed to a possible invasion, the US moved quickly to initiate their own counter-invasion strategy to retake the islands. The US chose the island of Guadalcanal as its first counterpunch on dry land, with the 1st Marine Division landing on August 7, 1942. During their prior invasion, the Japanese soldiers faced little to no resistance from a largely peaceful and unarmed population of local islanders. The Japanese Imperial Army's following treatment of the island natives was nothing less than abysmal during their invasion and short-lived occupation. The Solomon Islanders quickly began to hate the Japanese invaders for their cruelty, not only to them, but to the thousands of Korean forced laborers they brought with them. The Islanders thus did all they could to work against the Japanese and assist the American forces before and during their island campaigns. Prior to the war, the Royal Australian Navy had implemented a coast-watching intelligence network, which was comprised of civilians, district officers, plantation owners, and even missionaries. Upon discovering the Coast Watchers' existence, the Japanese of course tried to root them out, but failed time and time again. While these Coast Watcher men may not have been capable of hand-to-hand combat, they knew the islands far better than the Japanese. They were thus skilled at eluding capture, remaining hidden in the dense jungle, while spying on the Japanese and providing Allied forces with regular radio reports on Imperial troop movements. Apparently, it was a coast watcher who alerted the Australians to the Japanese airbase construction on Guadalcanal, who then passed this information along to the Americans, which was the reason the island was chosen for their initial assault. With the help of the coast watchers and the Australian Navy, the American forces quickly overran the Japanese coastal defenses. However, the entire campaign to retake the islands would still last for a total of 6 long and bloody months. After losing their foothold on the beaches, the Japanese began pulling back their forces towards the center of their respective island. They maintained an offensive strategy by way of guerrilla tactics, conducting raids on the American forces before once again retreating back into the dense jungle. The mountainous jungle terrain was very difficult to navigate, making it a slow effort for the American soldiers and Marines to pursue their enemy. Some islands were cleared of enemy troops within days, others took the entirety of 6 months. But as the Americans forced them further and further towards the central, unexplored regions of the island jungle, horrifying rumors then began to circulate amongst the Japanese soldiers. Reports were now being made about their men encountering giant, hairy creatures. Giant men. These giants were described as being between 8 to 15 feet tall with red eyes, some of which were covered in shaggy black, brown, or red hair. But while many such stories have come about during other military campaigns, stories about man-like ape creatures, such as the rock apes or batutut in Vietnam, these giants were considered an entirely different kind of creature. They were said to be much more human, and they carried massive stone clubs, spears, and other rudimentary weapons. When encountered, these giants were said to mercilessly attack the Japanese men who were unfortunate enough to stumble across them, smashing them with their heavy clubs, spearing them, carrying them off screaming, or even tearing them apart and eating them alive on the spot. Other stories describe the giants displaying territorial acts, bellowing loudly and ripping entire trees out of the ground in massive displays of strength, the terrified Japanese soldiers then scattering into the jungle. The men then tried to hide, laying low to the ground throughout the night, hearing the nerve-wracking sounds of these monstrous beings crashing through the dense jungle around them, hunting them. Sleep became impossible for the Japanese, not only from abject terror, but from the sounds of the giants' bellowing howls and the abruptly silent screams of fellow soldiers piercing the night air. As the battle raged on over the following weeks, during the daylight hours, the Japanese men had the American forces to contend with on their front lines. And by night, they now lived in a constant state of terror, unable to sleep for fear of what would happen to them if they were found by the giants. If these stories are true, it must mean that at least some of the Japanese soldiers survived to tell them. Captured by American troops, terrified by what they had seen, we can imagine these men would have seemed completely delusional when recounting their experiences to their captors. It should be pointed out that the thought of surrendering was unthinkable for a Japanese soldier, whatever the circumstances, although the idea of being ripped apart by giants would likely not have ever occurred to them. But traditionally speaking, their orders were to return home victorious, to die while fighting, or to honorably take their own lives if they were defeated. Many Japanese soldiers were of course taken captive during the war, but culturally, dating as far back to their samurai warrior ethos, the Japanese Imperial Army viewed survival following defeat as a shameful disgrace. If it was Japanese soldiers who came out of those jungles raving about man-eating giants, what became of these men is now unknown. 80 years later, their stories are now considered myths, at least to most people living outside the Solomon Islands. But bizarre as it sounds, many among the islanders themselves would assure us these kinds of stories are quite possibly true. For locals, the existence of giants on their islands, even their continued existence today, is no myth. It is a commonly accepted fact. The Solomon Islands remain an impoverished and developing country until today, and much of the nation's past has unfortunately been lost to undocumented history. But it is known that by the year 1942, much of the inner regions of the island jungles had long remained unexplored, even by locals. These dense jungles and much of what lives in them remain a complete mystery, even today. The reason for this is found in the islanders' ancestral origins. A couple hundred years ago, the Solomon Islanders were comprised entirely of highly territorial, tribal people. These people were known to be headhunters and even cannibals. Always at war with one another, these people lived in fortified encampments, possibly even treetop dwellings, for their safety and protection against not only dangerous animal life, but against enemy tribes. When Christian missionaries began arriving to the islands in the 1800s, the religious conversion that took place over the following decades brought an end to these tribal wars, thus eliminating the need to continue living in fortified villages in the hard-to-reach, mountainous jungle interiors. Instead, islanders then began building their peaceful village settlements closer to the beaches. This, of course, set the stage for the perfect, secluded environment for a species of cryptid monsters to now thrive in. Over the following 2 centuries, the interior jungles and what might live there became increasingly unknown, and few locals risked exploring too far into them. But something that did survive over the centuries were the local legends. As much as Europeans might have sung songs or told fables about man-eating predators to keep children from wandering too far into the wild forests, the island people told their children stories about something less conventional than wolves or bears. They told horrifying stories about cannibalistic giants. But why? Ask a local, even today, and they will tell you why. Because these giants are real. The Second World War seems to have merely cast an unexpected international spotlight on their existence. Nicholas Cox is a field archaeologist who has explored these islands in recent years in search of the long-abandoned remains of Japanese island fortifications and wartime artifacts, now buried in 80 years of jungle overgrowth. His interest in the Solomon Islands began in 2019 when a friend mentioned to Nick that he had worked on a Solomon Islands forestry initiative in 1995, his friend being the first non-islander to see the remains of World War II Japanese tunnels on the island of Kolombangara. Nick then excitedly began planning his own expedition to the islands, and it was during his preliminary research for this expedition that he stumbled across these accounts of Japanese soldiers supposedly encountering terrifying gigantic men. He noted that these stories about the Japanese encountering giants have largely been circulated by non-Japanese sources. However, these same stories do of course circulate in both English and Japanese-speaking cryptozoological forums, articles, and other websites, with Japanese people referring to these beings as titans. As fascinating as the stories were, Nick was disheartened to find no actual documented personal accounts or anecdotes from individual Japanese soldiers. Somewhat deflated by this lack of evidence, he started to think that the stories may be entirely fabricated. Upon reaching the islands, however, his interest in the stories was almost immediately rekindled. When he asked about giants, the locals' attitude towards the existence of them was shockingly mundane. They said it was entirely true, without any hint of the existence of such giants being mythological. Much to his surprise, some of the islanders he spoke with even assured him of the giants' ongoing existence even until today. Other islanders said they believed the giants had gone extinct, or possibly, because of their violent natures, had killed each other off hundreds of years ago, at least by the time the Christian missionaries had started arriving to the islands. As for the stories involving Japanese soldiers, while no locals could confirm these stories themselves, they stated that they very well could be true. And if the giants do exist, they said, the island's interior regions are exactly where anyone would find them. Few, if any, locals ever explore so far into the interior jungles, in part because of their very real fear of what might live there. During these conversations with the island people, who are primarily all devout Christians, along with the stories about legendary giants, they also acknowledged their family connections to headhunter tribes. They possess an ancestral history of which many locals expressed a feeling of remorse, and yet also a kind of morbid fascination with regard to the violent and cannibalistic behavior of their ancestors. Because the giants themselves are also thought to be cannibalistic, some islanders believe that their native ancestors were cannibals because their culture was influenced by their prolonged contact with these violent, man-eating giants. While many of the islands in the Solomon Island chain are said to have no giant populations to speak of, Nick was told that the island of Malaita is replete with giants. Bizarrely, a local man named Ishmael claimed that he himself was descended from these giants, and that among his family lineage was a particular giant who was a notable figure, a celebrated warrior from a tribe of giants on the island of Malaita who lived during the colonial period when headhunters still thrived. Ishmael explained that while many giants lived in the jungles, others, like his ancestral line, lived in the cave systems. Despite being separated on the surface by miles of ocean, there are locals who even believe some of the islands are linked by these extensive cave systems. Whether Ishmael's family history is believable or not, this idea of strange beings or cryptids remaining isolated by living in deep underground cave systems is not an uncommon belief around the world, whether or not it ties into the hollow earth theory that many ascribe to. As for the ancestral origin of the giants, among the Solomon Island people exists an understanding that, although they are a distinctly separate creature, whatever the original lineage of these giants is, it was born out of humanity. The name Solomon Islands itself comes from scripture, named after King Solomon. With the islanders now being primarily Christian, they may inherently ascribe the giants' lineage to that of a race of giants known in the Old Testament as the Nephilim. As such, because of their genetic lineage being traced back to humans, it is believed that they can thus still interbreed with humans, and the islanders even have stories about this happening. For instance, the Guadalcanal people and many other Solomon Islanders all know the story of Mango, a local woman who passed away in the year 2000. The story goes that around 1950, only a few years after the end of the war, she had disappeared from her village. After failing to find her, everyone eventually gave her up for dead. That is, until she was found, 25 years later, hysterically frothing at the mouth, clearly mad, in a garden on the northeast coast of Guadalcanal. Seeing that she was heavily pregnant and in need of help, the men captured her with some difficulty. Sadly, she remained mentally unstable for the rest of her life, but she was at least nursed back to the brink of sanity, enough to explain what had happened to her. Nothing much was ever said about the entire 25-year period of her absence, but she was able to communicate that she had been taken captive by a giant who had taken her as a wife. She claimed she was eventually impregnated by this giant, which was the child she was now carrying. Through her pregnancy, she eventually gave birth to what the locals believed was a half-caste boy. The boy lived to the age of 5, at which point, for some unknown reason, one of Mango's brothers, the boy's uncle, is said to have killed him. Some islanders are said to know where the boy is buried, and according to others, Mango is evidently just one of several women to whom this type of thing has happened. This account of Mango and the existence of giants on the Solomon Islands was largely brought to international attention when it was published in a book titled Solomon Islands Mysteries: Accounts of Giants and UFOs in the Solomon Islands. The author, Marius Bourrion, began living in the Solomon Islands in 1995, following the end of his own military career as an aircraft/helicopter engineer with the Royal Australian Air Force. Within his book are 2 more similar instances to the story of Mango, where Guadalcanal women have been taken by the giants. He also recounts many of the oral histories that were told to him by the islanders. These included stories about their ancestral tribes fighting literal wars with the giants, on occasions when the giants began killing the islanders, either for food or seemingly just for sport. Brazenly raiding their villages, as with the Japanese stories, there are horrible accounts of the giants eating people alive on the spot. Numerous village chiefs then sent their warrior hunting parties after them, only for them to return in vain with fewer and fewer warriors. From the accumulation of this research, it occurred to Marius that the giants had, for a time, considered the Solomon Islander people like pigs to be eaten. He believes one of the major reasons why the Solomon Island population is far smaller than they should be is because, with over 5,000 years of giants on the islands treating humans as food to be eaten, those people never had the opportunity to breed. He additionally suggested that from his own studies, his opinion on why the giants stopped hunting the island people is a culmination of three things: a war among the giant tribes that took place sometime in previous centuries, the introduction of firearms to the islands, and, quite bizarrely, alien intervention. Suffice it to say, the book makes for an interesting read. Having read this book during his expedition research, when he was interviewed in 2021 on the Into the Portal podcast, Nicholas Cox offered his own opinion on Bourion's work. Nick acknowledged that, despite his fascination with exploring any combination of military history and cryptozoology, such crossovers seem to always tread a fine line between reality and far-fetched conspiracy. He pointed out that Marius's book is heavily criticized by skeptics because of the author's frequent and seemingly sporadic deflections into his theories about world order governments, alien cover-ups, and his knowledge of the existence of subterranean UFO bases on the islands. If not only to add to the growing weirdness of this story, as indicated by Marius in his book, the islands are evidently no stranger to UFO sightings. There's at least one undocumented incident where American sailors described seeing dozens of bright orbs flying in a diamond formation over their ships during the invasion of Guadalcanal. Believing it to be some kind of new Japanese weapon, their defenses were scrambled, but the UFOs eventually disappeared without incident and were ultimately forgotten about in the following invasion. With regard to the existence of giants, however, there is another intriguing account that is attributed to Bourion and his time spent living on the islands. On the island of Guadalcanal is a gold mine, aptly called Gold Ridge Mine. For various reasons, over the last 30 years it has gone in and out of being an active mining project. But in the mid-90s, shortly following an extensive negotiation with the island government for the approval of the mining efforts, the mining company was finally given the green light to begin clearing out the surrounding jungle to open up the gold mine. At some point during excavation, one of the bulldozers was rendered inoperative when the massive dozer blade detached, one of its large retaining pins having broken. The blade weighed several tons, and because they did not have the necessary equipment to lift it out of the mud, the remaining pins were removed and the blade was completely detached. The men planned to conduct the necessary repairs to the dozer overnight and would reattach the blade the following day. So the crew and their equipment went home for the day, leaving the blade stuck in the mud. The next morning, however, the crew was startled to return to the site only to find that the massive blade had disappeared. Even more startling were the now 3 to 4 foot long humanoid footprints appearing in the mud around where the blade had been lodged. After scouting the surrounding area, the blade was found about 100 meters away on the side of a small hill. Baffled, the men realized that something with very large feet had seemingly picked up the blade and moved it. Possibly it had even thrown the heavy blade a good distance based on where the footprints ended and where the blade was found. This story offers at least something to compare with the stories regarding the Japanese encounters, in that the locals and mine workers always left the jungle areas before nightfall. The Japanese soldiers, however, had no choice but to remain in the deep jungle recesses overnight, for months, which might explain why they and these giants eventually crossed paths. If at all true, the giants perhaps became annoyed by their prolonged invasion of their territory, the noise of the gunfire, or otherwise felt threatened by these armed men, which resulted in their violent responses.